the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you are answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. At the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Tibbs, for the very kind introduction. So yeah, as you mentioned, we were colleagues at Montclair State for almost 10 years, and one of my first memories actually of Tibbs, and he doesn't know I'm going to tell this story, is he shows up and he's got this broken finger, and it's got this pretty big bandage on it at one point. And this is pretty soon after he had started at Montclair, and I'm wondering, like, was he in the lab? Was he like trying to get a sample out? Was he really doing some hardcore engineering or science or something? He's like, no, I was sword fighting with my son, and he got me like right in the finger. It's like, oh, okay. Any guy who like plays that hard with his kid that he's gonna break his finger, like, okay, good stuff. So I appreciate that. So yeah, I'm up here. That's my name up there, but I want to make sure that lots of acknowledgements go out to both my colleague, who's in Dirk van der Klein, a professor in the biology department, as well as let's see if I can hit the right button. Oh, I can. All those students down there, all those names. And as you guys know, being students, you're the ones who do most of the work, right? You can nod your head to me. So you do all the work. So lots of this work was actually done by the students on the ground and all those names down there. So it's me up here standing. You clap for me, which is very nice of you, but I want to make sure that recognition goes to those folks who earned it. So I'm going to be talking about this invasive plant species called Japanese knotweed and its impact on water supplies here. And this is a sustainability seminar, I realize, so I'm going to try and coach it into those words and try and put it into that world. At the same time, I am happy to pause and talk about whatever you would like to do. A couple of you, I think, have been in my class and realize that I'm happy to go talk about something relevant. So if you have a question, don't wait to the end. Please let me know if I can explain something. I'm trying to stand still for the camera, but I'm also happy to go over and we can talk about a graph on the screen for like 10 minutes if you really want to get into it.
Well, I think leverage of like 5 feet or something.
5 feet? Okay, good. Will it beep if I leave the area?
At the end of the first study.
Okay, end of the first game. Okay, excellent. Perfect. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, good. I like to wonder. So, like I said, if there's something I can explain, let me know, and I'll be happy to go off on some relevant tangent if that's not an oxymoron. So, sound good?
Yes.
All right, let's do it. All right, so I've become a fan of telling you sort of the answers up front, at least not for exams. So this is what I'm going to be talking about and the main points I'm going to be making. That there is this invasive plant species, and I'll get to that in a minute, called Japanese knotweed, and not a very big area of it. And by that I mean maybe a quarter of this room, not a very big area of it, uses about as much water as a family of 4. So a small area of this plant has a really high transpiration rate and can have a big effect on water resources. It's really efficient when it compares to local plants. So it really uses a lot of water for its photosynthesis. It can, when you take a little patch like this, you do the math and extrapolate up to a watershed scale place, which is where I feel much more comfortable talking about these things. Some of these things, I wish my biology professor colleague Dirk van der Klein was here, but when you extrapolate to the watershed scale, this can have big impacts on how much water this plant is actually using. That's the kind of so what? Why do I care about this invasive plant species? And then we'll talk about how as this plant species spreads, it can impact areas like the Highlands region, which here in New Jersey supplies water to about 5 to 5.5 million people. So drinking water is good. As he takes a drink of water, that's where we're going. Okay, so invasive plant species. A little bit of background here. Basically, invasive plant species have lots of different characteristics, but here are going to be the main ones that'll work for us. So they're not native to the area. In this case, the Japanese knotweed, you can guess which country they originally came from. Because they're not native to an area, they often don't have predators or some kind of consumers that will inhibit their growth. So in this case, there's a plant species, there's not a lot of insects, there's not diseases, there's not other things to keep it in check, and they can spread quite rapidly. They also tend to outcompete other species. In this case, it's plants. So they have high reproduction rates, they have high colonism rates. It grows a lot like bamboo, which is a kind of a more familiar plant to lots of folks. It spreads quite rapidly. It's very hard to kill. You can chop down the entire plant and it'll still be there the next winter. So it's a really durable, maybe from sort of a plant perspective, you got to give it some props because it's a very durable plant. But it has this ability then, also these invasive plant species, to alter their environment. So some of the invasive plant species around here that are pretty common are these Japanese knotweed. They're distinguished by these big heart-shaped leaves, like about that big, and when they flower in early summer, they get these big sort of white frondy flowers. Phragmites is a plant that grows all around the meadowlands. It's, 2-3 meters tall at times. It's a pretty classic invasive species. And then my least favorite, it's multiflora rose, or Rosa multiflora, this wild rose that grows up along stream banks. As I mentioned, I spend a lot of times doing fieldwork on rivers. I lost so many pairs of boots and waders to this stupid plant. It just punctures everything, and it sticks, and it's not my favorite plant. So that's some of the background on invasive species. In terms of water impact and how they use water resources, there's all kinds of implications for this. One is just a basic kind of sustainable water management. What's the water coming in? What's the water coming out? In this case of invasive plant species, they're affecting what water's coming out in terms of out of the system. So we're defining our system as local water supplies. As these plants have their high transpiration rates, they will take water out of the system, put it up in the atmosphere. And if you're the manager of a local reservoir, a local drinking water district, whatever it is, that's water lost to you. Sure, that water is going to come back somewhere else, but for you, for your purposes, it's gone, it's lost. There are a lot of folks that care a lot about the second point, biodiversity, and how the plants actually are structured in the local ecosystem, in the community. And this has not just implications for folks who value biodiversity, but it starts to impact things like carbon budgets, and how much carbon gets stored in different places, whether it's above ground in the plants, below ground in the soil, and that obviously has large implications. And so then, not surprisingly, the riparian species, the species that grow around rivers, they can have big impacts on those. So there's lots of water, obviously, in riparian areas, those areas right next to rivers, and they also sometimes have rather unique plant species. So just some basic background on generic invasive plant species. Some of the previous research that's been done, we're certainly not the first folks to tackle this issue, generally focuses on areas that are water limited. So dry, arid, semi-arid, desert areas, whatever you'd like to talk about, this is where some of the research has been done. And kind of the poster child for this is a plant called tamarisk or salt cedar. Originally came mostly from the Middle East and Central Asia, but it's this plant that is really effective at using water. It has very deep roots. It can go much deeper into the ground and tap deeper groundwater resources than other native plants in the southwest United States. Its leaves have a high salt content, so it alters the soil as it sheds its leaves. It's a deciduous plant. So it actually alters the soil around it and makes it inhospitable for other plants to grow. And again, from kind of an evolutionary plant aspect, it is really impressive what it came up with. In South Africa, there was a study where they figured out that about 10% or so of a river's base flow, that low flow conditions that exist between rainfall, those conditions exist. I'll assume for one more, right?
Sorry to...
Okay, that's okay. So what we wanted to figure out was, hey, what about an area like New Jersey? Can these plants have a big enough impact on an area that we don't think of as being water limited? You know, this is not a region that it's arid or semi-arid by any means, so what kind of impact can they actually have? Any questions so far? Let me just pause. I'm a teacher with my not here, so I'm just happy to take pause. And folks, from how familiar are folks with invasive species? Have you worked with these much? Is it a term that's newish or somewhat familiar? Okay.
I was on an invasive species task force in Bergen County.
Excellent. So, and what did you do for that task force?
I think every foot of a trail, we identified any kind of invasive species on the trail and reported it with a GPS and, you know, just wrote it down on a clipboard.
Did you do anything to it? Rip it out or destroy it or kill it or
No,
burn
we
it or
didn't.
any?
No, because actually Japanese knotweed is very hard to fly to the ground.
I would say almost impossible. I certainly, yeah. What plant was the most common, or what are ones you remember? Any particular?
Barberry?
That's another one, Japanese barberry. Sold a lot in nurseries. It's got this nice kind of rustish, reddish, rust-colored leaf with little cute little red berries on it. But the spikes are ridiculously sharp. You kind of look at it wrong and you get a splinter. It is just stupidly sharp. So yeah, that's another favorite plant. But I just haven't spent as much time around that. So okay, it's good. So some familiarity with invasive species. All right. So a little bit of background on Japanese knotweed. That's one of our first students, Rob, who was working on this project. So this was originally brought here because it was pretty and it was easy to grow. And it really was named, I didn't know there was such a thing, the Ornamental Plant of the Year, whatever that is, 100 and almost 75 years ago now at this point. And it really likes to grow next to rivers. It is extensively found next to rivers, although we've also started to see it in more upland areas away from rivers. It's got a really high leaf area, which is a biologist's way of saying it has lots of leaves. And they can measure this in terms of the area of leaves per square meter of ground. And you can actually, so you can imagine like leaves kind of stacking up upon themselves, and this can have really high leaf area indexes. So it has the ability then to do lots of photosynthesis and lots of transpiration as well. And then it's got this extensive root system, which makes it being pulled out of the ground to be a gigantic pain, almost impossible. So this plant can be completely chopped down. That's what it looks like in midsummer. It dies every winter. Well, the above ground stuff dies every winter, and then it grows back to 2.5 meters every single spring and summer. So it's a really hardy, really, again, sort of admirable from an evolutionary perspective plant. So we didn't have much idea of what was going on with this plant in New Jersey or really other places. We tried to find, say, published transpiration rates. We couldn't. We didn't know how much was there. We do know there were these invasive strike teams, task forces. There is like task forces. So they do work around. So they do have some.
Strike team is good.
That's I think what it would take. I think some they call in some tactical strike and get rid of these stupid things. So we could try and garner some of their knowledge, but there really wasn't a lot of knowledge that we could build on. So we wanted to figure out, how does it compare to some of these notorious species like tamarisk? Does it actually transpire as much water? Does it actually use as much? And then how much of it is in areas that supply drinking water? So we want to have some very practical aspects to our research as well. My research tends to head in that direction. The areas that Dibs mentioned, I like my research to have an applied, which I think also works for a lot of you. So our goal then was to try and measure the transpiration rates of a patch. That's what it looks like. I'll use the word patch because it's sort of like a stand, but it's not a stand of trees. It's something majestic like, I don't know, oaks or maples or something. It is just thick, and that's what it looks like next to a small stream. So we wanted to see how much it transpired, how much the actual liquid water it takes and converts into water vapor as part of photosynthesis, and then try and extrapolate that to our watershed scale. So that was our goal. And I always remind students when they're undertaking research, thesis, or dissertation or whatever, have a specific goal in mind. Keep asking yourself, why am I doing this experiment? Why am I doing this particular thing? Does it help me achieve my goal? Because sometimes I see students, they're just going gung-ho down this one path and doing all these certain measurements and experiments, but they're not quite sure why they're doing it. So make sure you have a goal in mind as you do your work. What is this helping me answer? Okay. So these are some of our very initial results, and I actually this project goes all the way back when I was a PhD student, gosh, I won't quite do the math at this point, a few years ago at this point, and this is what I found in our local river. I had sensors out, and they look sort of like a fat magic marker, and they would measure depth at different time intervals. And so I could put them in a stream and I could go measure things like flooding and some other things that I was particularly interested in. But then I happened to see this kind of pattern. So we have the stream depth or level in centimeters up there, and we have time going across our horizontal axis. So, just like I ask my students, what do you see? First step in scientific method, make some observations. So I'm not asking for any interpretations here, but what do you observe up there? What's that, sir?
It's decreasing.
It is decreasing. So this is what's called river base flow. So Rivers are awesome. So I have completely biased. Oh, I've lost my zone here. Rivers are awesome. So it is decreasing over time. This is it actually decreases at an exponential rate. This is what happens to rivers during dry periods. They slowly decline as they're slowly depleting groundwater sources. So there is most definitely an overall negative slope to this. Completely agree. And that's what happens to rivers during what's called base flow, when they're being supplied by groundwater, hasn't rained for a couple of days. Rivers around here are probably close to being back at base flow. We had all that rain yesterday, so they're probably not quite there yet. But if it wasn't going to snow today, which is going to mess up them up again, this is what rivers do. So rivers at base flow have this negative slope to them, most definitely, declining. What else do you see? Any other patterns besides just declining?
Diurnal variations.
We see some variations in that. So we have some fluctuations going up and then down and then up and then down. And I didn't see this data, this pattern in it until I'd spent way too much time with my data. And you've probably already done that. If not, you probably will. Where you've just seen the same plot over and over and over again. You zoom in, and Dibs, I'm sure, can relate to this, where you just looked at it too many times. And it's like, what is this pattern? And so what happens to this pattern is we get these low periods in the middle of the day. The scale's not the best to work from. And then we get higher periods during the middle of the night. And this is the transpiration signal. This is what plants are doing to the stream. What's the magnitude between high and low? Ballpark. I'm a big fan of ballpark numbers. How much? About a centimeter. I'll buy that. So, you know, that. Probably not noticeable if you're there, but the stream's actually noticing it. That, you know, the plants transpire, goes down a little bit, they turn off at night. They don't literally turn off, but they stop transpiring at night. The water levels bounce back up as they be replenished by groundwaters. The next morning, sun comes back out, transpirations pop up, the water level goes down, transpirations go back down at about this time of day, a couple hours earlier, and they go back. So really cool that there's this connection then between water levels and transpiration rates. So what we did was we had a patch of knotweed about as big as this room, a little bit smaller, but about as big as this room. And what we did was we measured depths inside this patch over lots of different time periods. So you can see there's lots of different data points right there set up. And we could do some stats. And so after we cut this down, and that was what one of those students did, was they cut down all of those stems. They plucked the leaves off these things, measured leaf area index. It was very laborious on their part. We could figure out that the depths after we harvest them got a lot higher. So that's kind of a no duh, but it's nice when the actual numbers back you up and the statistics back you up. So we did have this nice correlation that inside this little stream, and this river is maybe half as wide as this room. It's a very small stream, and it's maybe knee deep at this point. So we're not talking a lot of discharge. This is not the Passaic River we're talking about, or the Hudson, or any decent sized river. This is the third river that runs right through Montclair. It is more of a stream than a river. Was there a question?
Is there a pattern when you when you look at this in like different seasons, let's say winter, spring, autumn?
Sure. So if we looked at this right now, this is this is July. What would we think this would look like if we looked at this data right now? We collected. Let's like.
Would be higher, right?
Would be higher. Would we see this diurnal pattern?
No, because it's deciduous, so there are no leaves.
Probably very low transpiration rates going on right now, yeah. I mean, maybe, so the evergreens, they have a little bit of photosynthesis, but they're kind of dormant too. So, yeah, I think in winter, it would just be, you would just see the negative slope.
It's in the middle of July.
It's the middle of July. So yeah, so this is prime transpiration rate for these trees. They have to store up all the sugars they can for times like this during the winter. So they are doing as best they can right now. So yeah, this is prime, but this up and down. So this will go for May, June, July, most of August, and then kind of tail off. So, you know, these are the kind of patterns we can see. And this fits into this newish field called ecohydrology or biohydrology, this connection between biology and hydrology, which is a lot of fun. I really like this kind of interdisciplinary aspect of it. And the recognition that, you know, just because I'm a hydrologist or geologist or something, I can't talk to anybody outside of that field, and those barriers are broken down. So it's fun. I hope as students that you get to recognize some of that. So, other questions? Yeah?
How can you measure the stream level?
That's a really good question. So what happens with this device, and it's a little bit bigger than this remote, is I take a metal bar, sort of like an upside down J, and I pound it into the bottom of the stream, and I clip this on, and I put one rock on top to kind of cover it up. And it measures total pressure above you, above the sensor. How much air do we have above us right now? Anyone know?
1 atmosphere.
Okay. I would like a unit of length, please, Dr. Sarkar. I don't know, 10, 15 miles? It's 20 miles of real, it's a lot of air, right, to make a really scientific statement. 1 atmosphere, sure. So if we're talking about water that's this level, compared to all the air on top of it, you have to subtract the air. Air changes a lot. What was our weather like yesterday?
Much colder.
Much colder. So there's a front that moved through. The air pressure changed. So what you have to do is you have to have another sensor that is sitting in your office or sitting on someone's desk. I can't. Sitting somewhere nicely like this. That's measuring just the air pressure. And what you do is you subtract the one that just has air pressure from the one that's in the stream, and all you're left with is the change in water. And when I was first doing this, I thought it's going to make it more accurate, but it's not going to be that big of a deal. And if all you do is you take the sensor that's in the stream that's recording both the stream and the air, you're measuring weather patterns. Because all you're doing is really measuring this much water versus the 10 to 15 miles of air above us. So yeah, you have to have at least 2. One that records air pressure and one that records both the stream and the air pressure. And then you just subtract the 2. And thankfully you have Excel. Because you can set that, and these little data recorders, they're pretty slick. I think they can do 30,000 data points. Something like that, recording in them. As a graduate student, I messed up my units, something to learn by. I wanted to record 15 minutes, and I set the units to 15 seconds. So I completely missed a bunch of data, but I had a really high resolution data set for like a week. You do that mistake once, and then you learn. So, yeah.
And how did you consider the tidal influence?
Good. So these are upstream of tidal influences. So we're way above the tides. Otherwise, that would have messed us up. Yeah, so these are freshwater streams away from tides. Because otherwise, we would have had to probably, I'm not sure, we'd have to do some more math to kind of take out those tidal influences. So yeah, we're above the tides. Yes?
So what's caused the outlier over there?
What's caused the what, sorry?
Outlier.
Oh, outlier. These, it's a really good question. I don't know. Some of the times I will notice if I take the sensor out and I'm uploading it to my computer, that's some of those points. So yeah, one of those, you're sort of talking about those guys? I'm not really sure. It's one of those ones where I look at all these black dots, I don't know how many there are, so I'm just going to ignore those 3 or 4 or 5. So, I don't know. When I first started to become a professor, I felt bad about saying, I don't know. Now I don't feel bad. Part of being a scientist is being comfortable with saying the unknown and saying, I don't know. Because that's where the interesting stuff happens. If all you do is you figure out what's already known, what's the point? So, do you have a question or you're just, I can't tell you.
I was just agreeing with you.
Okay. All right, let's keep going then. So this is where I took the site. So we are, I must admit I didn't make a new map for this, but we are just off the map, right? We are just like down there right now. So here's Route 3 coming across. So Montclair State Campus is up here. We took a bunch of measurements, both of this little tiny stream here, which is called the Third River. It was the third river that came into the Passaic River. So they were very original. The first river, the second river, the third river. The first river's gone. It's buried under streets and cities and everything else. It's just no longer a stream. We still have a second river, we still have a third river. So there's a third river that flows in the Passaic. This is the Passaic River winding around here. We have Patterson, we have other places. And this is this other little stream, again, half as wide as this room, maybe knee deep at normal conditions, called the Peckman River. So we'll be talking about those 2 rivers in some detail. So this is what we did. We, and mostly my colleague Dirk, measured a lot of transpiration. And so there's different ways to do this. You have light meters. You measure actually the pressure difference inside the leaf versus outside the leaf. So you clamp on this little meter. That's what it is. There's this lower piece here that you can kind of see half of, and then this taller piece on top. They clamp between a leaf, and they can actually measure how much gas the leaf is producing through photosynthesis. So they can actually do that. So you can get measurements then of things like this, which is 10.5 liters per day per square meter. So you can extrapolate how much is coming out of this one leaf, how many leaves I have per square meter, and you get a number like that. You then can take the math and say, okay, well, if that's my per square meter, how big is my patch? And it was almost 150 meters. So we've got about 1,500 liters per day. And I think this is basically a liter. So 1,500 of these per day that this one little patch, again, about half the size of this room, is transpiring. So okay, so that was our one patch, and we made those measurements at a couple different places to see what local variation there might be. So then we wanted to see, okay, how much of this stuff is there? So we went out with just a laser rangefinder, the kind you might buy in a hardware store to measure, typically lumber or construction kind of sites. And there's another one of my students, there's Masha, down there measuring these things with the laser rangefinder. So we wanted to see what's the length and width of these patches. Just some simple geometry. So how wide's a patch, sort of this contiguous stretch, how long is it? Length times width, we can figure out the area, good to go. So they slept along almost 6 kilometers of river, just walking along, noting things, figuring out the GPS locations of these, taking the measurements. And what we figured out was that in these basically 5.5 kilometers, we came up with these 2 different categories of unmanaged versus managed. We first called these wild or natural, but then we realized we're in northern New Jersey. There's nothing really wild about this place, at least when it comes to these kind of areas. So we came up with unmanaged. So unmanaged are just kind of left to do whatever they are. The plants are doing what they want. There's no one in there gardening or pruning or weeding or anything they want. And along these stretches, there was about 4.5, or a little over 4, square meters of knotweed for every meter of stream. So it's a slightly weird unit. So for every, if I take a big step, I go 1 meter downstream. In that 1 meter of stream, as I'm walking down the stream, there is 4 square meters of knotweed next to me, on average. Not every single place has 4 square meters. Some has more, some has less. But for every step I take, there's another 4 square meters of knotweed next to me. So that was in the unmanaged category. The managed category, if you just keep in mind something like a golf course, which is very managed, and we basically found 0 knotweed in those stretches. So a golf course is very particular about what kind of plants grow up there, and maybe it's a public park. Those are also tend to be pretty well managed in terms of the plants. And basically we found 0 there. So it was kind of a binary situation. We either found a lot or we found very little. So we didn't think we could use an average to try and extrapolate. We didn't think that would be a very fair assessment. So what we did in GIS, in Geographic Information Systems, was in GIS we use aerial photographs to classify the streams into different lengths, or into different categories. And so we had about 28 kilometers of stream length total. About 10.5 we classified as managed. And so again, just from a photograph, is it a golf course, is it a city park, is it someplace where people are closely monitoring what plants are growing up? Okay, so that's 10.5 kilometers. We then take the other part and say, okay, we're going to classify this as unmanaged, and assume that those 4 square meters that we measured before is going to extrapolate for those entire 17. So certainly there's some error. I mean, certainly I guess this is somewhat of an estimate, but we felt pretty confident that we mapped almost 20% of this. We mapped 5.5 kilometers of this. So we didn't just walk for a minute and call it goods. We covered a fair amount of this watershed. So we have these sort of binary categories where we have very little knotweed, or 0 knotweed we're assuming, and then we have a whole bunch in the unmanaged, or wild if you want to go that far. For the neighboring stream, that little one, Peckman, the exact same methodology was used where we had 11 kilometers of stream length. The managed sections was a lot less. In this case, it's dark blue. I didn't use the same color scheme, sorry. And again, we applied sort of an extrapolation of 0 knotweed for those. And we had over 8 for unmanaged. And this was even higher. It's even thicker patches. So again, my students went out and matched it. So again, for every meter you go downstream, there's 10 square meters of knotweed on the stream banks sitting next to you. So there's a lot of knotweed on this Peckman River. Much thicker patches, much more extensive patches that are going through. So, math. I think this is probably a pretty comfortable group with math. Sometimes I start showing equations on the screen and I think I've already lost half the class, but I'm guessing that's not you. Okay, so here for the third river, we want to figure out how much water we're using for the entire watershed. So, step you through the math. we've got about 17,000 meters of stream that we have 4 of unmanaged stream and a little over 4 square meters of knotweed per meter of stream. So we can just take those two numbers and multiply them together because it's per meter of stream. The units work out. So we've got about 70,000 square meters of knotweed sitting in this watershed. We then take that number that we came up with before, the 10.4 liters of water per square meter of knotweed, and again, using our units, and we're getting a little over 1 million liters per day, or that conversion into 1,000 cubic meters per day. So a box, that's a meter by a meter by a meter. About 1,000 of those used by this plant every day. I don't know, 1 million liters is not an easy number for me to wrap my head around. I don't deal with that unit very much, or that kind of quantity, but that's about as much water as 2,500 people use per day. So not insignificant amount of water that folks are using. For the two watersheds then, the Third River and the Peckman, we can kind of do the same methodology where we come up with a little over 1 million liters per day that these plants are transpiring, that the Japanese knotweed is taking out of the water system and putting up in the air. And again, it's not destroying the water. Water is a very durable substance. It's not, but it's for your metric, for your sort of reckoning, if you're doing water resources management in New Jersey, it's leaving the system. So if we compare that amount to the amount of water that flows down these rivers on an average August day. So it's an hot August day, we have high evaporation rates, we have high transpiration rates. Those rates of Japanese knotweed transpiration equal almost 10% of the two discharges. So 10% of the water in the rivers is being transpired out of the rivers up into the atmosphere. And if you recall, I won't quiz you, but about 20 minutes ago, salt cedar, the tamarisk, the sort of poster child of infamous impacts of invasive species on water systems, was at 10%. So here we are in New Jersey at basically 10%, if I can round up 9.9 to 10, and almost 7.5%, 7%, so pretty significant for it. So okay, so those are our two watersheds. That's the Passaic River system there in blue. Our two river systems that we measured are there. Third River on the right, the Peckman River on the left, those two little red squiggly lines. So I wanted to give you sort of broader state view of New Jersey, because then we're going to talk about the Highlands region. And the Highlands region is up there in green. There's different shades of green depending on the classification system for the Highlands region. It's a really interesting region in terms of environmental management, and there's all kinds of stories that you can go into, but we're not going to do that as part of our class. So what I want you, though, to get out of this map is that the areas in green supply water to the areas in blue, purple, and pink. And the number of people served is close to 5.5 million or so out of the Highlands. So the Highlands is the water supplying area for this. Whenever I look at this map, I'm always impressed by how far south this water gets pumped. So we are going outside watershed boundaries. This is almost like western water that we get this. If you look at some of these darker purple, I'm going to call that purple, it's hard to see the scale. The pinks and the purples, that's over half of their water comes from the Highlands region. And if you're in the purple, it's over 75%. So there are some areas that have huge amounts of water supply coming from the Highlands region. So the other issue with the Highlands region is that already big chunks of it, so this is, let me go back up. This is going to be just the areas in green, whether it's the light green or the dark green, shown on this next map. These are sub-watersheds, and most of these sub-watersheds, a little over 60%, are already in water deficit. So a water deficit refers to the water budget, and the water budget works just like a budget would for yourself. For a personal, your checking account, savings account, whatever, you have things coming in, salary, whatever, lottery winnings, whatever, you have things coming out. So water budgets work the same way. You have inputs, precipitation, maybe rivers, whatever inputs, hydrologically speaking, you have, and then you have outputs. Maybe it's, again, rivers, maybe it's people pumping, and most of them are already in water deficit. And I realize, again, the scale is hard to read, but these yellow, orange, and red ones are the ones in water deficit. And the red ones are in the range of 1 to 7 million gallons per day in water deficit. And it's, English units, because this is a government agency that put this together, so they're going to put in units like gallons. But still, we can all picture what a gallon is. 1 million gallons per day they are in deficit. That might be the antithesis of what sustainable is in terms of what's going on. So that's before we add in the impacts of knotweed. So as knotweed begins to spread and will add to this deficit, because they're just going to take water out and transpire to the atmosphere at an even greater rate, this map needs to be updated. This map's from 2008, I'm pretty sure. And then you throw in climate change. And the temperature story with climate change is relatively straightforward, even though controversial as it is outside of scientific circles. Another story that maybe could be told a lot, but outside the seminar. The hydrologic aspect is even more complicated. Because sure, as things get warmer, you increase evaporation rates, but that water's got to come down somewhere. So it's a little bit paradoxical to think of, but you can get droughts, which I think makes sense with climate change as things warm up, but you can also get floods because there's more water vapor in the air. So it's a lot harder to figure out the hydrologic impacts of climate change compared to the temperature impacts. Because it can intuitively say, okay, we have more evaporation leaving the system, so we're going to have less like soil moisture, but then that water's got to come down somewhere as precipitation eventually, so I might have drought and you might have floods. Yay. Okay, so here's, in the US, we're here in the Northeast, increased evapotranspiration rates under projected climate changes and probably decreased river discharge. And that has to do with a variety of factors, not just total precipitation, but the kind of characteristics of that precipitation. Is it coming down in one giant intense rainstorm? Is it still coming down as kind of lots of softer, less intense rainstorms? So that gets tricky. Okay, so this is what I've told you before at the beginning of the talk, so I'm telling you again. So, a patch of knotweed, not very big, uses the same amount of water as 4 people, that it can have this big impact, up to about 10% almost, of water from the discharge, water in the river discharge. It can also have, and we didn't really talk about this, significant impacts on aquatic habitat as well as food systems and how much water can go in and out. And then, how does this affect our resources in terms of sustainability? Is this going to make things easier to plan for, harder to plan for? A lot of times this plant is in addition to what's already there. So sometimes invasive species replace something. But a lot of times we found that this is actually in addition to what's already there. So there's riparian trees, there's not a lot of riparian vegetation already going on there. So the numbers I put up and I've been talking about for the last little bit are in addition to what has already been transpiring, no pun intended, naturally. So that's what we got. So we do realize that this is not exactly a huge area, but it's not that small of an area. So we'd like to map these things in the future. As maybe you know that as you do your research, there's always extra questions you can ask, and there's always one more set of measurements you can do, and there's always something else you can do. So these are some of the things we want to do and kind of move to adjacent watersheds, extrapolate out to other watersheds, try and compare some other transpiration rates of some other species. And I have some slides about that, but I think at this point I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions. So, yes, excellent.
In the areas that you did conduct your research,
Yep.
were you able to determine how long the Japanese knotweed was there for?
It's a really good question, and no. I have no idea how one would do that. Because it's not like, they're not a woody species, so you can't like count tree rings like you could with a big tree. No, unfortunately not. And there's not that much data on sort of the spatial distribution too, because it'd be scary but pretty awesome to have like a map where like the area is increasing over time, but then you'd need some different spatial and temporal measurements. So unfortunately not, but if you figure out a way, let me know. So, yeah.
Have you looked at any methods of controlling it?
Yeah, they have some, and what they have is effective, but it's really either labor intensive, or resource intensive, or like herbicide intensive. And these things grow up next to rivers, so people get nervous, understandably, if you start dumping a bunch of chemicals on them. So there's nothing really practical out there in terms of trying to limit it. And as I said, most of these that we found are kind of like, streams, they're like behind a grocery store, or they're behind a parking lot. So who is really in charge of that chunk of stream? It's sort of everyone and no one. It's sort of a tragedy that commons-ish. So if it's kind of no man's land, no person's land, then who's going to take up the expense and the resource to do it? But yeah, sometimes they burned them, but you have to do that repeatedly because they have such a large root mass of nutrients stored below ground. So I mean, so these things, again, they're almost as tall as this room. We can level a patch, literally cut down every single stalk. The next year it grows right back, as if it's like, no big deal. It shrugs it off. So again, from an evolutionary sort of biological perspective, it's really impressive what this plant does. For our aspect, it's not so good, but it's all based on perspective. Yeah?
Is there any specific variable that increases its rate of spreading to the islands?
Yeah, we haven't done as much research on it, but it seems that people have agreed that either floods can transport sort of chunks of the root downstream and move that way, or people are still growing this. It's still legal to grow and sell in several states. There's a list of states, I don't think New Jersey is one of them, where this is illegal to sell. You can't sell this in a greenhouse or something, but it somewhat goes to one's opinion on government regulation, and should we have them or not.
They don't have enough already? They need to grow more?
Well, enough is a relative term, isn't it? Yeah. What you might call enough, it's such a pretty plant. I mean, can't we have some more? So it depends on perspective. Starlings, I think, are this terrible bird species that are only here because we had this William Shakespeare fan who released them in Central Park like 140 years ago, which is a true story. And they're this super annoying, but some people like them and they're pretty. So, yes, I would agree that we have enough. But then, I mean, it's one of those things where this is, in my opinion, one of the roles of science. We inform people of the sort of consequences of choices. So yes, we can have Japanese knotweed, but this will be the consequence to our water resource. So we can have this really pretty plant, but we're going to have to find different water resources. Maybe build some desalination plants, or I don't know, something. And then as a society, we can come together and figure this out. And that works in all kinds of different aspects. Flood control for around here. How much do we want to invest in flood? These are the different costs and the different choices and what's going to happen to sea level. And then as a society, we can all come together and maybe agree, well, this is probably the best choice and the fairest choice and helps the most people and all those kind of things. But to me, that's one of the fundamental roles of science, is gathering this information so that we can make informed decisions as a society. But then what those decisions are, that's outside then the realm of science and goes into all kinds of other aspects. So if you are doing research in this area, you have to be prepared, I think, somewhat to leave the nice defined realm of science and, I've got R-squared values and p-values and things like that, and go into well, this is somebody's backyard maybe you're talking about, or it's their favorite plant you're talking about. And then they don't care, transpiration rates of liters per square meter per day or something. It's very personal then. Or if you're talking about flood protection, well, this is the house my grandfather built, or whatever, right? There's lots of different aspects of science this applies to. But as a scientist and as future scientists, I urge all of you to have that ability to speak up, lend your voice and information to the debate. That's what we need you for. Our generation could use some help. How about that?
Shamar, you had a question?
Yeah. Another thing. From the data, you said that the Peckman River had less knotweed cover than the Third River. So have you looked at any possible limiting factors between them?
It had, actually, so this case it's the other way around. But yeah, one of them had a lot more than the other one.
Yeah.
We haven't gone to those characteristics because it's sort of labor intensive to try and map these patches. One of the things I'd love to do, is anyone familiar with LiDAR data in this room? A couple of you are, okay, so cool. So everyone's familiar with radar. We've all seen weather maps and, I don't know, airplanes or something. So LiDAR is just like radar, but instead of radar and radio waves, it uses laser. So it's really high resolution. And so typically airplanes fly it, and you'll get returns off different surfaces, and you can use it for all kinds of cool things. There are some town planning departments that use it to find people who have built illegal additions onto their homes, because it can literally pick up small things like this. For us, what we would love to do is, if I can find a picture where this knotweed exists, somewhere back to this, so this top picture. So what a LiDAR could do is it would have a return off the top of the tree canopy. That'd be the first return. It bounces off the top of trees. It would then have another return where some of the lasers would hit this patch of knotweeds and bounce back at like 2 meters above it. And then it would have a very hard return where it hits the surface of the ground. So I'd love to be able to get some LiDAR data and try and tease out some of these knotweed patches, because there's nothing else that looks like it. So I think on the LiDAR signal, and then we could start doing some like, yeah, is the soils, do they get saturated or not? Do they have, I don't know, certain pHs or something like that? That would be really cool to look at. So LiDAR data is, if you've never looked at it, it's a lot of fun. Not when you're doing his work. After you're done with his work, then you LiDAR data.
Josh, like, can the remote sensing data be extrapolated to, come up with this kind of information?
You can, but a lot of times if it's a summertime like this, when it's the only time it exists, then you've got covered by tree canopy.
Right.
So that's where the LiDAR data could go through some of that. But yeah, the visual stuff, you lose it because, a lot of visual things are taken during the winter, which makes sense, there's no leaf, but then this stuff is dead.
And these plants are obviously like, they are water intensive, that's
Yes.
a bad thing. But like at the same time, they have a deep root system, so they are serving some kind of a purpose, right? Like again, at least like, from the erosional aspect.
Yep, they certainly anchor stream beds. They might be, and we haven't looked into this too much, they might be pumping a bunch of carbon down in the soil.
Right.
So they are a carbon sink and removing carbon out of the atmosphere. So maybe I should apologize to Japanese outlet for the last 45 minutes of what I've just been said. It's complicated, right? Anytime you have a natural system, again, you leave the lab, you go out in the real world, oh yeah, it's not. But that's the fun part too. If it wasn't.
The carbon aspect of it might be something very interesting,
Yep.
Like,
And
with all the carbon offsets that we are getting, that might be something that some of the ecologists might want to look at sometime. You should have probably brought Dark along.
I should have brought Dirk along. He's a fun guy.
Yeah.
It's easier to talk about him when he's not here. So, but no, he's a really good guy, and he's been really good to work with. And it's a lot of fun to work with someone outside of your own field because they just have a different perspective of looking at things. And there are times where it's like, oh, that's what you mean? Oh, I call it this. Oh, I thought you were referring to this. And so there's some kind of translations also, but at the same time, it's a really fun way to figure out problems that you couldn't do on your own. I could figure out the stream depths all on my own. He could figure out transpiration rates on his own. But together, we can do some cool stuff. So
that's the thing, I keep on telling these guys, like we are talking about two scientists, like one from the geological side of things, geomorphological side of things, and the other one ecological. It's it's still interdisciplinary. Now in sustainability, there are so many things that you have to bring into the equation. It's not only just two scientists talking about their areas of expertise. You're going to talk to the business people who are basically driving the whole sustainability movement anyways. And then you have to talk to the social scientists, who do not even speak our language. One of the jokes that I always crack, whenever I get a chance, is me and my wife, we are married for about 23 years. We got married when I was 25, she was 23. So the only reason we are still together is because he has a PhD in public policy in social science and I have a PhD in geochemistry, which is natural science. We do not talk.
My wife's a biologist, so we're a little bit more overlapping. But is there still enough difference where it's like her animals and yeah, she's off doing her thing, and I'm like and the guy, yeah. So I'm just appreciative of the fact that rocks don't move, and she's trying to track things and move. Anyway. Yes.
I have a question. So the difference between the higher and the lower base flow is 1 centimeter, right?
In this river, yeah.
So my question is, have you checked if it's because it's July and maybe I don't know how much of this land is managed, and maybe there's a golf course around, and maybe the groundwater level is fluctuating during the day. So have you took into consideration the groundwater level?
Sure. So we haven't done much in terms of ground. It's a lot harder to measure groundwater than surface water, so we haven't done as much with it. And maybe some of those outliers that the gentleman asked about earlier, maybe some of those points are a flush of water coming down because somebody dumped their swimming pool, or I don't know, somebody just did something weird. So we've seen this actually throughout the summer though, and lots of different places. So it is a long-term summer trend. And if it was a golf course, it's out of sync because unless this golf course is watering a bunch at night, we have peaks at midnight. So
what do you mean?
So if a golf course, I would expect if a golf course is watering during the day, we would see this pulse during the day. These are pretty small systems. There's not going to be that much lag time between them. So if they were irrigating or doing something weird, so that's why any one of those points, I don't have a lot of confidence in any single one point. If you ask me what that point, pick a point, I'm not quite sure. But it's when you have all these points that form all this trends together, I have a lot of confidence in, I don't know how many points are up there, several hundred. So yeah, I definitely, I didn't cherry pick, but I selected, what do I have? Almost a week's worth of data up there, but I could show you the entire summer and you would still see that same diurnal pattern with heights. It's about 2 a.m. is the highest and about 2 p.m. is the lowest every single day.
Because 1 centimeter is too small, like for error base flow. That's why I'm.
Well, right. So it's imposed on the declining base flow as you go down. So it's this superimposed sort of sine curve basically that you're putting under this. So yeah, so I agree it's not all that much, but then you start taking things down by a centimeter and across the way and it can sort of start to add up. But yeah, I think if we were out there and looking at the stream and then came back and looked at the stream 12 hours later, we wouldn't notice a centimeter worth of change. So, yeah.
So did that data also take into account the evaporation from the water surface?
No, so this would be just stream depth. So this data or all data?
This data.
This data, no, this is just stream depth. This is just straightforward measure of stream depth. So everywhere. So yeah, so maybe you would see some there too, where it's a little bit, but not a lot is probably evaporating at this point. It's not a very high surface area compared. But yeah, that's a decent point. That would help accentuate that curve. So yeah, you could look at like sunny days versus cloudier days and use Eggman to try and come up with some evaporation numbers. Evaporation is one of those things that we can all understand, but measuring it accurately in the field is stupendously difficult, unfortunately. And separating that from transpiration is even harder, which is why there's that nice convenient word evapotranspiration. As a hydrologist, that works for me because I don't really care. Most times when it's plants and waters, I care for this study. So that's why I don't bring dirt along, because then I can just say evapotranspiration. It's all the same thing, right? It's liquid water going to water vapor. Who cares if plants are doing it or not? So, Dirk's a good guy.
All right, let's thank the speaker one more time.